This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. For 38 years, the Roscoe Ellis Jr. Lectureship has brought prominent scholars in soil science to Kansas State University. This year, Doug Ming traveled to K-State to share his experiences as a planetary scientist at NASA. During this two-part series, Doug shares insight on his experiences growing up as a Colorado farm boy, studying agronomy throughout college, and ultimately leading Mars Rover missions over the course of 2 decades. He shares insight on how Mars soils compares to those we know well here on Earth, his advice for students, and the potential for life on Mars. We end today's show with Jason Griffin, director of the John C. Pear Horticulture Center. He was the featured horticulturalist for February's K-State Garden Hour, where he provided an overview of vegetative propagation, the process of making new plants that are genetically identical to your existing plants. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by a very special guest. His name is Doug Ming, and he is a planetary scientist with NASA. He is joining us today for a conversation on his work with NASA, specifically with the Mars rovers that he's been a part of helping man. So that's an incredible conversation we have coming. But he's been brought here to K-State specifically because he has served as the lecturer for the Roscoe Ellis Jr. Lectureship. It's the 38th edition of this program. And Doug, we are so lucky to have you here at K-State. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, this is great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I know you've been very busy. Your journey here to K-State has been full of the lecture series, obviously, but you're also talking to a bunch of graduate students and undergraduate students and joining us. So I really do appreciate you fitting us in.
I tell you, I've been here now for about 5 hours, and it's just been a lot of fun. The thing that I love about talking with particularly students is that space seems to spark something within them. And start talking about the research we're doing at NASA, and I can see the eyes get wider, the smiles get broader, and even a little bit more excitement in their voices as they're talking. And so it's been a lot of fun to see that today, particularly with the students.
Absolutely. And you're speaking to students because your background really is in agronomy, but you came from Colorado, right? You grew up as a farm boy. That's kind of where you started?
Yeah, I was born and raised in eastern Colorado, grew up just across the Kansas border in a little town called Ray, and I went off to school at Colorado State University, and my degree was in agronomy. And I got to know a lot about good old Kansas agriculture while I was up there. I was back here in the state of Kansas for 4 of my summers during my undergraduate and graduate studies as a consulting agronomist out in Scott City.
So walk us through this journey. What inspired you from a young age? Were you extremely interested in soil? How did it translate to space?
Yeah, so I grew up on the family farms. We were involved in growing all the things you see in western Kansas, corn, sugar beets, wheat, and also a little bit of ranching. And that was kind of what we, did, and that was what my interest sparked me when I went off to college. And I did flail just a little bit when I got to Colorado State on my major, but I quickly evolved to getting my degree in agronomy.
Wonderful. And you said you got 2 degrees from Colorado State, and then you went to Texas A&M for your PhD. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Any experiences there that shaped you and kind of, because I think when most people hear agronomy, we think of a lot of the work that goes on here on Earth, obviously, the soil science and things like of that nature that play into agriculture. So at what point did you kind of feel this interest, this spark in work outside of our planet?
Yeah. So it's one of these things, if I think about this a little bit, I think there are 4 different reasons why I probably ended up working for the space agency. And one of them is that I had great teachers and mentors when I was growing up, and they all encouraged me to go off to school. So mentorship was really important in driving me in that direction. And then the second thing I think is important is being in the right place at the right time. During my final year of graduate studies at Texas A&M University, 2 guys from NASA showed up one day in the department, and one of my professors screamed at me down the hall. He says, "Doug, come here, I got something for you." And I said, "Okay, what?" And he says, "There are 2 guys from NASA here, and they want to know if they can grow plants in lunar materials." He said, "Are you interested in talking to him?" And I thought, wow, this is cool. So I said, absolutely. And talked to them, and they encouraged me to write a proposal for a postdoc. I did so, and that is, being in the right place at the right time got me to the space agency. And when I got there, then I had to figure out what in the world to do with growing plants in lunar materials. And this next area that I think got me really involved in this is I was ready to step outside my comfort zone. I think that's really a key, is that I was trained in traditional agriculture in western Kansas. And this gave me the opportunity here to go in a totally different direction. And it was not easy. I had to persevere, and it was a lot of hard work. There weren't very many soil scientists working at the Johnson Space Center for NASA at that time. And so it was a lot of work to get things that we wanted to do there at NASA on how we would go about growing plants on the moon.
That's incredible. So I'm sure those are a lot of the points that you've been speaking with students too as well, because those are great pieces of advice for students, just to keep an open mind, explore all their options, but to also, have that area of resilience built within themselves, right?
That's right. Absolutely. And I think that's what sparks, and I see these eyes go up a little bit, and wow, I do this kind of research. Man, maybe I can do that on the moon, or maybe on one of our assets in low Earth orbit, like the International Space Station, for example, or one of our next stations we're going to put up when we actually send humans back to the moon, which we're in the process of doing right now at NASA.
So that first project that got your foot in the door was exploring this lunar material and growing plants in it. Tell us a bit more about that project.
Yeah, so as I said, I didn't know a whole lot about lunar material, so the first thing I had to do was find out what it was composed of. And again, this is where mentorship really came in important in this, is my mentor there said, well, the best way to learn about this, let's write a chapter on it. And you're going to be the lead author on this. And so that forced me really quickly to learn about lunar materials. And I found out after I got started on this that these lunar materials weren't a whole lot different than some of the volcanic materials we see here on good old planet Earth. There are some unique properties and things like that alter the surfaces, mainly physical properties from impacts that are hitting the surface. But that's kind of what I had to do as far as getting over some of these first hurdles on growing plants on the moon.
Incredible. So obviously that research was successful because you've stayed at NASA since then, right? So the work that you started with, how did that translate into you now manning, operations on Mars?
Yeah. So, we have changes in administration every 4 to 8 years, and that usually changes a lot of times the directions of the federal agencies. And so some of the work we were doing seemed to not be quite as important anymore when we went through one of these administration changes, and those programs kind of went by the side a little bit that I was working on growing plants on the moon and on Mars, and the work we were doing also with life support systems in order to help keep humans alive on these planetary surfaces for long periods of time. And so I decided to return a little bit to what I was trained in my graduate years, and that was in soil chemistry and mineralogy. So I directed my new research towards going to Mars, and I did that by doing research through the eyes and the instruments that were on board the rovers and landers that have landed on Mars since about the year 2000.
Wow. So if people aren't familiar with all of the different rovers that have been on Mars at this point, what are some of the names that people might be more familiar with hearing of?
Yeah, so the first rover we had on Mars was this one called Sojourner and then Pathfinder. These were little bitty rovers that just didn't get very far from where they landed. And then we evolved into a little bit larger rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. If you ever get the chance, there is a new movie out on the rover Opportunity that we were just talking about here before this segment that describes the ins and outs and daily operations of one of the rovers. Opportunity, we called it Goodnight Oppie. And this gives you a really good idea about the operations of this rover on Mars. Then there have been landers. We have had several landers. One of them was what I called the best soil science laboratory to ever land on another planetary surface, the Mars Phoenix Scout, that had a soil testing lab in it. We actually tested the soil, just like a soil scientist would here on good old planet Earth. And then it evolved into 2 other missions that were much larger, much more sophisticated rovers with really intricate instruments on it. Those 2 are called Curiosity and Perseverance. Curiosity and Perseverance are both still operating today on Mars. Curiosity's been on the surface for a little over 10 years, and Perseverance for 2. The unique thing about the latest rover, Perseverance, is that it is also collecting samples that NASA plans to return to Earth in probably the next 10 years.
So that's the crazy part, I guess, about this research that you've been a part of, is that the effects of it are going to be still to come in the future, really. There's so much that's still to explore, obviously, specifically with Mars. I feel like that's going to be an area that NASA continues to explore more and more. But when you think in hindsight of everything you've experienced so far, is there any of the work that you've done that really stands out and you're like, wow, I can't believe I was a part of that?
Yeah, just this pure thing of being involved on a mission on Mars is just wow. I think that it really hit me hard one time how important this all was. I, on a couple of the missions, have led the tactical operations for science, which means I walk in on a day and I am in charge of getting all of the scientists and engineers on the same page on what we are going to develop and send to the rover to do that day on Mars. And it's just an incredible wow moment, particularly when I was at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory walking in knowing that at that day I was going to be leading a rover on Mars that could make a major discovery. Now, as far as the wow discoveries, all I can say is that there are so many of them that all I'd be doing is sitting there saying, wow, the discovery of minerals that could only be formed under standing water. In other words, there were bodies of water one time on Mars. All of the elements that are necessary for life are present on Mars. Now, we haven't found an alien yet on Mars, but there's a good chance that there could have been life that formed in the past, because we're almost certain that Mars was once probably a habitable environment, had a habitable environment, and could have formed. But the conditions on Mars right now today are so drastic that we just can't believe life would persist on Mars. But who knows? Subsurface, we might find aliens.
Sure. Yeah. I guess that's probably one of the common questions you probably get when you tell people you work at NASA, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's a question that's asked me of a number of times. Are there aliens on Mars, or are there aliens anywhere in the universe? I could answer that, but I am not saying that I've ever seen an alien out there. That's all I can say.
Wonderful. We'll leave that one at that then. Our conversation with Doug Ming is not ending here. We'll continue it ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. We're continuing our conversation now with planetary scientist at NASA, Doug Ming. He recently joined K-State to serve as the 38th Roscoe Ellis Jr. Lecturer. You're familiar with Western Kansas's soil type. When you think about the differences between here on Earth, maybe in Western Kansas, compared to what we see on Mars, you just explained it's a bit more difficult when we think about the current conditions. What are some of the similarities and differences?
Well, the similarity is a lot of the same minerals that are in Western Kansas soils are also in the quote-unquote, we'll call them soils on Mars. There are some major differences. Water, well, we got a little bit more water in the soils of Western Kansas than we do on Mars. Mars soils are really dry. And as far as the fertility goes, well, most farmers in this state have to add nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and other elements to their plant growth systems, their farms, their land, when they're growing their crops. Same thing we'll probably have to do on Mars. But I don't see any showstoppers. I definitely think that we can, and we will eventually someday. I may not be around to see it, but we will be growing plants on Mars.
Things to look forward to for sure. And it sounds like the similarities are more so there than there are differences in a lot of ways.
Yeah, especially with Mars. Mars is so much like Earth. It was evolving just like Earth, but about 3.5 billion years ago, something drastically changed. And we're not sure what that is. We're still trying to figure that out. But Mars probably lost its atmosphere. The water probably was not any longer stable at the surface. But there was a period of time when we definitely see evidence that there was water standing at the surface. And that is the time when, there could have been potentially life that could have formed there.
Incredible. Awe-inspiring. And we've already mentioned that you've been speaking with students throughout your time here today. So when students are interacting with you, what are kind of some of their questions, especially those that are probably in agronomy, which is the area that you studied to begin with?
Well, the first thing is that they are thinking my research is not applicable to what NASA does or what we need to do for critical research needs for space exploration. And so, I have to kind of coax them a little bit and go, now, what are you doing? And I says, that's something that NASA would have to look into. And I think that's the big thing, is that they get this little light bulb going off and says, wow, I'm confined to this little bitty test plot out in Western Kansas or just out here on the research farm, and this might be applicable to Mars. So I think that's the big thing that students really kind of light up on when they start talking about their research.
Absolutely. Yeah. Expanding their viewpoint kind of to seeing how it could be applied in other ways.
Yeah. I mean, it's this whole thing that I was talking about, being ready to step outside your comfort zone. We all get so comfortable with our own little bitty area here. We don't think about maybe, wow, step over here, maybe something else new will happen. And I think that's the big thing, that students get a little confined. They get just a little bit blinded with what's right in front of them. And that's understandable. You're trying to get your degree done. You're working really hard on getting that research finished up, writing that thesis or dissertation so that you can graduate. You can go out and get a real job. So, it's understandable that they're that way.
Yeah, but still some encouragement to, let your imagination flow a little bit. And as an adult in these scenarios and as a student, there's still room for that.
Yep, absolutely.
And what better? I feel like most kids today, even when I was a kid, I went to space camp and I was so excited. And there's just something about space that, like you said, it ignites that spark in people's eyes.
It does. It does. The first time that I thought about growing plants on the moon when I was back at Texas A&M, I wish I could see my eyes. They must have got great big back then. I go, wow, and that just really does spur you on. I have found, I am a firm believer in trying to excite the next generation. And I have found through my work with NASA over the last 35 years, space exploration is probably one of the easiest ways to do that. You can get students really fired up about the math and sciences that they don't like so much. If you don't do those, you're probably not going to be heavily involved in Mars or moon missions. So it's really key for a good education. And they think about that for a while. And I think it does help some to think about doing well in school and maybe going on and getting advanced degrees or at least go to college.
Absolutely. Inspiring for sure. And when you think about your role that you play now, how it's evolved over time with NASA and the work that you do with the rovers, you mentioned that you're technically retired now in our conversation before, but you still are a part of operating these rovers now from your home.
That's right. Yeah, I retired, but maybe I didn't quite retire all the way. But I did keep some of the activities. One of them is I still have quite a bit of interaction with colleagues, students, and postdocs that I worked with, making sure they get their papers out the door and get those published. But I also couldn't quite let go of my operations. I love that. I like I said, you probably noticed how excited I got when I was talking about walking in that gate at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, knowing you're going to lead tactical operations. I do that now, although I do it from the confines of my home. I do that, as I tell people, well, I'm leading rover mission operations today from the banks of the Guadalupe River in central Texas. It's pretty cool to be able to still do that.
Yeah, it's inspiring, and it's also almost mind-blowing to think about the ability of that, how far technology has come.
Yeah. I've been doing this now for 20 years. And you think that after doing it for 20 years that maybe I'd lose a little bit of my excitement for it. I led tactical operations 2 days last week. And I tell you what we were doing was absolutely incredibly exciting. And never get tired of that. That's just, you don't know what you're going to see that next day on Mars. It just really excites you to want to do it again. And I'm signed up for a few times next month, so I'm going to do it some more.
That's awesome. The age-old saying of if you do something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. It sounds like you've certainly done that.
Yeah. And working for NASA, I've had a dream career. I could go on and tell you the opportunities that working at NASA has given me, but you don't have enough time on this show to do that. But it's just been absolutely stunning. The opportunities has been put in front of a farm boy from a little bitty town in eastern Colorado. It's just amazing what you can do with just a little bit of hard work. And like I say, maybe you got to be in the right place at the right time, but you got to also look for those right places at the right time. And so I hope, students will be doing that in the future here in the state of Kansas.
Absolutely. And when you think of where this Mars rover research is going in the future, is there anything in particular that you just can't wait to see to come to fruition? What really are you looking forward to most?
Well, this Mars sample return mission, where we are collecting samples. NASA made one of their landmarks in the mission last week, where we deposited the samples that we've collected so far, ready for the cache return vehicle to show up. And the cache being we cache the samples down and we're storing them there, and we're going to bring them back to Earth from that spot. And that's going to take about probably, I'm thinking, 10 years before we'll get those back. NASA's working hard at getting all the details worked out on exactly how we're going to do that. But the samples are ready. And I really be excited to see those samples come back, because that'll ground truth a lot of the research we have done from the rovers. We got great instruments on the rovers, but there's still a lot more we can do in our laboratories with those samples back here on Earth, and I would really like to see that.
Absolutely. Well, Doug, it's fair to say you have had an incredible career from a young boy in Colorado that then went on to study agronomy, at land-grant universities, that has now gone on to work at NASA researching soil types on Mars. Incredible. And it's wonderful that you've joined us here at K-State to tell us about that story. So I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here today. I've just enjoyed the daylights out of my stay here at Kansas State.
Well, and I know you have a lot of K-State connections as well, so I'm sure it's been good to catch up with some former colleagues.
It has. Talking about the old clan, we had a group of us at Colorado State. A number of those ended up here at Kansas State as professors, and so I have a lot of overlap with colleagues here at K-State.
I don't want to take up too much of the rest of your day because I know you still have a lot of students to see and a lot of former colleagues. So thank you so much again for joining us.
And thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Doug Ming. He is a planetary scientist with NASA who has worked with Mars mission rovers. Before we cut to a short break, landowners in Kansas can now apply for a prestigious award. Kansas Livestock Association's Scarlett Hagens says the award recognizes those who make conservation a top priority.
The Ranchland Trust of Kansas, Sand County Foundation, Kansas Association of Conservation Districts, and American Farmland Trust now are accepting applications for the 2023 Kansas Leopold Conservation Award. In honor of renowned conservationist Aldo Leopold, the $10,000 award honors farmers, ranchers, and other private landowners for their dedication to stewardship of the land, water, soil, and wildlife in their care. Landowners are encouraged to nominate themselves, or applications may be submitted on behalf of the individual. Applications for the 2023 Leopold Conservation Award are due by June 1st. Landowners looking for more information or those interested in applying can go to sandcountyfoundation.org. The Leopold Conservation Award in Kansas is made possible thanks to generous sponsors, including the Farm Credit Associations of Kansas, ITC Great Plains, Evergy, Kansas Department of Agriculture, Division of Conservation, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, Kansas Forest Service, McDonald's, the Nature Conservancy in Kansas, Natural Resources Conservation Service, Green Cover Seed, and a past Kansas Leopold Conservation Award recipient. I'm Scarlett Hagens.
Once again, that was Scarlett Hagens with the Kansas Livestock Association with a word on a prestigious award that Kansans can now apply for. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. The latest K-State Garden Hour, hosted by K-State Research and Extension horticulture staff, focuses on vegetative plant propagation. Dr. Jason Griffin, director of the John C. Pear Horticulture Center in Hayesville, explains how vegetative propagation, cloning, and asexual propagation are different than growing plants from seed.
One of the easiest ways I like to describe this to people who aren't experienced in propagation is to explain to them that a plant generated from a seed is not genetically identical to the parent plant. Much like your children are not genetically identical to you, to mom or dad, their genes are a combination of mom and dad. So seedlings are genetic combinations of mom and dad parents. That is not what a lot of nurseries want. They want clones. They want genetically identical plants. So that's why we vegetatively or asexually propagate these plants. Some of the steps involved in cutting propagation. Obviously, we need to collect our cuttings, treat them with a root promoting hormone. There's chemicals out there which can help your cuttings generate roots. Maintain the proper rooting environment. Very important. And then patience. Patience, patience, patience. 30 years I've been propagating and I still can't wait to take a peek and see if those cuttings have got roots. 4 weeks is on the early end for really easy to root stuff. If you're trying to root a magnolia cutting, you're going to be up to the 14, 16 week time period. So be patient. Experienced propagator once told me when I was a younger man, he said cuttings will do two things. They will root or they will die. Wait till one of them happens. So be patient. And then transplanting, hardening them off, and sanitation is huge. If you visit a commercial nursery, you will see a propagation facility is generally a pretty clean facility. You can imagine a cutting that has no roots is really susceptible to pathogens, insects, anything that would delay the generation of roots is going to put that cutting at risk. So sanitation is really, really key. Collecting your cuttings. One of the most important things, and it's going to sound really, really obvious, is take cuttings from healthy plants. The physiological condition of the stock plant is really important. You want to make sure you're taking cuttings from a plant that is not under moisture stress. You're going to take that cutting and remove it from its root system. It doesn't need to be under moisture stress already. To help with that, we try to take cuttings from plants that have been irrigated. We try to take them in the morning. If we're taking them here, then they go right into the greenhouse for processing. If we are out on the road, an ice chest and plastic bags and driving just slightly at the speed limit is probably ideal to get back here as quickly as possible to process. We want to keep them moist. We want to keep them humid so that they don't dry out. Nutrition of the stock plant is really important as well. You do not want to be taking cuttings from a plant which is showing signs of, iron chlorosis or just general poor growth or nitrogen deficiencies. It needs to survive for several weeks while it's generating roots. So a plant which is already stressed is no good. The age of the stock plant is really, really important. As your plant matures, the ability of it to generate new roots goes downhill rapidly. Younger plants, definitely better for propagation. And then the growth stage, probably one of the most important things is growth stage. We classify cuttings with regards to growth stage as hardwood, softwood, or semi-hardwood. Hardwood is generally anytime after a hard freeze until they start to push new growth in the spring. So right now you're taking cuttings. These are hardwood cuttings. Softwood cuttings, generally think April, May, June in our area when plants are actively growing. That's a softwood cutting. They need to be treated as such. And then semi-hardwood cuttings are generally after growth stops, but before that freeze. So after they've already set a terminal bud, the wood's firmed up a little bit. It's not soft. You can't bend them. They've got nice, good terminal bud, and they have not received a freeze yet. That's semi-hardwood. Really important when it comes to propagating plants. Some plants will only root at one stage and not another. Some plants only root hardwood. Good luck rooting them any other time of the year. Softwood, any other time of the year. I mean, it's really important. So think about that when you're collecting cuttings.
That's Dr. Jason Griffin, director of the John C. Pear Horticulture Center in Hayesville, with information on vegetative propagation. The complete K-State Garden Hour webinar series is available online. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.